I think to some extent medicine has driven itself to the ground. And I think medicine has come to represent not those, what I would call profoundly beneficial changes, but things that are divisive, things that are politically fraught. And there have been, I think, there's been a lot of politics at work.
In a sense, these are such incredible innovations that have happened. And it's, again, 15, 20 years, 30 years. Yet the disdain for science and the disdain even for doctors seems to be growing. And maybe COVID was a big catalyst for that. But why then? Why is there this?
Well, I think to some extent,
disdain's a strong word, but I don't know what word you would like to use.
I think to some extent medicine has driven itself to the ground and not fully been able to convey its power and its tremendous impact on human history. I'll just give you the broadest example of this. It's in the book as well. In the 1850s or in the less than 100 years ago, the chances that when you had a child that you would die in childbirth were in certain areas on the order of 20-30%. Childbirth was a deadly event. The chances that you would die in before you were 60 years old was on the order of 70-80%. Lifespans were 40, 50, 60 years. You would be lucky if you were 60 years old. In the last less than a century, even 50 odd years, we've seen an extension of lifespan into the 80s in some countries. And we've seen the oldest humans well into their 110s, 115s, 120s, and so forth. So there's been a massive change, mostly affected, I think, by changes in larger. It's not like medical intervention has caused all of this. Mostly affected by larger changes in hygiene, sanitation, social and behavioral health, but health nonetheless. And I think medicine has come to represent not those, what I would call profoundly beneficial changes, but things that are divisive, things that are politically fraught. And there's been a lot of politics at work, in the sense of sort of the anti-science movement, the anti-vaxxer movement being one edge of that, the anti-science movement. So I think some of it is the fault of medicine itself, in being unable to convey its value to humans, and some of it has been the politicization and the divisiveness and the use of medicine as a scapegoat for political divisiveness, both in this country and in many countries around the world.
So also, do you think it's kind of paradoxical that this anti-science movement has also come at a time when, medical advancement has touched almost all lives and, saved so many lives? So do you see that as a kind of a...
Well, there's some paradox about it, but as I said, medicine and science has done a particularly bad job in conveying, demystifying, and really pushing it, making the public understand what it is about, what it's doing, what its purpose is, what the grand project is of medicine. It's done a very poor job of it, and I think and the result of it, as I said, is partly the fault of medicine and the medical sciences, and partly because of the political divisiveness. It's been used as a tool.
Is it also the commerce of it? There's a sense that
absolutely,
there's a sense that the motivation for science is becoming more and more commercial than it was. Would you agree with that?
To some extent, yes. The motivation of science has become commercial. There's certainly an element to that.
Which is not necessarily a bad thing, or is
well, so I was just going to say exactly that, which is that the motivation of technology, digital technology, has been explicitly commercial. and in fact, you could make a very strong argument that digital technology and social media have certainly have had empowering roles in our society, but have had grotesquely divisive roles in our society. Even today, the main use of Facebook and Twitter seems to be to troll other people, et cetera, et cetera. But you don't see the same disdain for digital technology, which is number one, highly commercialized. Its sole purpose seems to be to make Mark Zuckerberg some extra money, or Elon Musk for that matter. Its divisiveness and its political divisiveness seems to be, if anything, just as deep, if not much worse, than medicine. But you don't see, people standing outside the office of Facebook with posters, or maybe you do, but you certainly don't see the public backlash, the anti-science or anti-medicine backlash that you see. Part of it also is because we think of it, perhaps accurately, we think of medicine as something that is supposed to be benign. It's supposed to be not commercial. It's supposed to have hold itself to higher ethical values and ethical standards, and that's absolutely fair. It is. It's a humanistic science. It's the most human of all sciences. Whereas maybe the digital world got off easy by starting to portray itself as a Godzilla and ending up as a Godzilla.
Yeah. But I mean, in your book, and I think in your books, I've not read all of them, but I certainly have watched enough interviews. There's a sense that I get where Big Pharma is kind of a villain in the book. I mean, if Big Pharma was a character, it'd be a villain. I mean, to what extent do you think, they've been extremely exploitative, somewhat exploitative? But, is Big Pharma become the villain globally that Big Oil used to be at one point?
I think Big Pharma has become the villain. I personally don't think it is the villain. Okay. I personally don't think. I think some Big Pharma can be a villain, just like I think Big Oil can be a villain, is a villain. In fact, to some extent, I think it is a greater villain. I think big digital tech can be and is a villain. I mean, it really depends. We would not have the global outreach of vaccination, not just for COVID, but for all vaccines, had it not been for companies, just to name a few, Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca among them. You can't produce, a small company, a small startup cannot produce medicines for the world. You need the pharmaceutical. If I was to wave a magic wand and make the pharmaceutical industry disappear, I can guarantee it will be a loss for human beings.
Of course.
And so, on the other hand, I think the flip side of that is, of course, that the pharmaceutical industry needs to take itself and its responsibilities pretty seriously, and find a middle ground, which it really hasn't. Now it has to some extent, but it hadn't. It was, highly resistive, highly resistant to change, highly resistant to the idea of social good, and finally, after multiple years of resistance, has finally come to a place where it's trying to recognize and starting to recognize the idea that it has to make some deep changes within itself. I don't think Big Pharma's. I mean, as I said, if I was to wave a magic wand and make Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and whatever, Bristol Myers Squibb disappear, I think the world would be poorer for it. But on the other hand, I also do think that the pharmaceutical universe needs to take its responsibilities quite seriously. I'll give you one last example of this. All of you must remember the role that Cipla. So I know Yusuf Hamid as a friend. I have the pleasure of knowing him as a friend. Remember the role Cipla played during the AIDS pandemic. At one point of time, in most of Africa, virtually all the AIDS medicines were coming from Cipla until world trade agreements, really led by the pharmaceutical lobby, hand slapped and handcuffed Cipla, and essentially made the creation of antiretrovirals, monopolized the creation of antiretrovirals. Since then, there have been, since that moment, I think many of these companies have come to realize that there are greater social goods that they need to deliver on, and have started taking their role in all of this much more seriously, much more effectively, and much more responsibly.